And welcome to the Lance Roberts podcast. I'm Rich Rosso today, and I have a special guest, Gary Collins. And Gary Collins is from thesimplelifenow.com. It's not just a web address, it's his entire way of life. And he's got such a very interesting, unique background. Military intelligence, special agent for the U.S. Department of Security Services. He's got degrees, but most of all, I think he's just a prolific author. I've only picked up 2 of your books so far, Gary. I know you have The Simple Life about health, and I think you're working on finance. I've read Going Off the Grid and The Guide to Decluttering Your Life. And I heard you on Coast to Coast, because I can't sleep at night. Mm-hmm. And, keeping that on at night while you're sleeping makes for very interesting dreams. But
I bet.
One comment you made, which resonated with me, and we're going to talk about in a later segment, but I want to tease it up, is about housing. Okay. About how much that you actually will lose money on a house. When you start adding all the dollars that you've spent and so forth. And we'll talk about the simple life and the finance side of things, which I absolutely 100% agree with overall. So the first book that I read was Going Off the Grid. And people say, listen, they get all frustrated. Sometimes I say I'm going to go work at Walmart, but I got to be really upset to say that. But I do say I want to get off the grid, but you did it. I mean, you actually took the steps to do it. And when I read the book, you cover every facet, anything that could happen. But what I know you had multiple motivations to do this, going off the grid and literally doing it. But what was the primary motivation for just saying, you know what, I'm actually going to do what everybody talks about?
Well, as I explained in the book, I grew up very rurally. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere. My town. The town I was attached to was about 1,800 people. The town I lived in about 20, 25 miles away had less than 100 people.
Wow.
So I grew up, I was more of returning to my roots, and it was purely for freedom and kind of turning off the noise. After, growing up that way, I went from a town, of 1,800, and San Diego State was 38,000 people. College, I was a fish out of water, to say the least. Mm-hmm. And from that point forward, I just, as a youngster, you like the city, it's fun and that. And you get a little older, you go, okay, this kind of sucks. I'm not really into this anymore. And it was more of just returning to a simpler life is what it boiled down to. Not that city living is terrible. I know some people love it. It's just not for me. I grew up in the mountains. I grew up in the outdoors. I love it. It's the best years of my life is what I call it. Don't realize it as a kid. Because as a kid, you're mad at your parents and say, why do we live in the middle of nowhere? There's nothing to do. But I seem to fill my time pretty well. It just was with for the most part, positive activities.
And I think they're all healthy activities, which we're going to get into how important health is to you for wealth and just wellness overall. But the book itself is so thorough. I mean, it covers everything from where you start to off the security that you're using off grid. I think even on Coast to Coast, you were talking about security as well. And it's a guide for even, if I want to hire contractors. But what's a day in the life of actually doing this? In other words, any surprises, lessons that you've learned outside the book that you've experienced while living off the grid?
Yeah, and I cover that more in the book called Living Off the Grid, which was the follow-up to that. Oh. And that's why I wrote it. People were asking me more questions about exactly that.
I've got to get that one.
What's the irony of that question is? I used to get that question all the time when I worked for the federal government as a special agent. Everyone would always go, what do you do every day? And I go, every day is different. And that's kind of how it is with living off the grid and living remotely. My days are geared to what I want, basically. I run my own business. I'm very, very fortunate. I'm an overnight success that took 10 years. It took a decade.
Right.
I've been building this from the moment and getting here from the moment I left the government a decade ago, close to a decade now. And everything's been kind of put in place. I'm a type A. I'm a planner. So each step and, what's your pain threshold is what I always say. Because everyone looks at me and goes, oh, I can't do that. And I always say, first of all, you should never start something that you're interested in or something that you want to change in your life with "I can't." That means "I won't" is what that means. Instead, you should say, well, I'm interested in what you're doing. How do I do it? And it's a mindset. And that was kind of my mindset. I used to look at this endeavor and go, oh, I'll never be able to do that. And some life events had to happen, some rather tragic. And I said, enough's enough. If I keep putting this off, it will never happen. So I just came out and I kind of had a good idea where I was looking, because I'd spent another 7 years prior to that looking for this property. So this is almost a 20-year making when you go front to back.
Okay.
And there's no guide, there's no roadmap. True off-gridders know that everyone does it differently. Of course, there's some off-gridders that tell you do everything wrong, don't follow them. They're the people who have dug their heels in the ground, and if you don't do it their way, you're an imposter. And, if you have running water, it gets bizarre land. Those are not the true off-gridders. True off-gridders, we all have our own way. We figure it out. We do things a little bit differently. And that's the beauty part of my days. When I wake up, kind of figure it out. The night before, I kind of plan the next day. But I'm a writer. I run a business. So I have my list of things that I do every day. But once I'm done with that, it's pure random. It's whatever I feel like doing for the most part.
Well, and you're so resourceful, and you have skills, as I read, going off the grid. But I do see on your website how many other, you've written the Simple Life Guide to RV Living, but there's the Living Off the Grid. So that's my next read that goes through the experience of being there and doing it. I think it has to be, too, you have a mental set of wellness. In other words, you have accomplished what 99% of Americans haven't, which is you find satisfaction in other things besides acquisition of stuff. Yeah. And there's more to what you're doing. And I think I try to do that when I write to people about financial wellness on the blog and lowering costs and creating financial bandwidth and breathing room overall. So interesting stuff. And then I want to get into really the Simple Life Guide to decluttering your life. What tips would you give to somebody that says they want to start this? It's more a romantic notion, but I know it's for you. It's 20 years in the making. But they may have grown up in the city, but they would like to go more rural. Maybe not to the same degree, but what kind of suggestions would you have? Maybe what would be your top suggestion for somebody looking to do that?
Well, and that's why I wrote the book. And why I write my books is to help teach people what I've done and what I've taught other people to do. And I always write to the everyday person. That's the whole goal, right? Mm-hmm. Some old timer RVers and off-grid livers get all bent out of shape because they didn't learn anything new. And I go, I didn't write the book for you. Why would I write a book for someone who's been living off the grid for 20 years? I'm writing it for people who want to get started. They're the people that need help. And it's hard for some people to get that through their mind that, of course, these are beginner books.
Yes.
That's where most people are. So with that, the thing I always tell people is you need to have two primary things if you want to live this life. And you don't have to live off grid. You can live on grid and live more rurally. You can have all public utilities ran out there and have 20 acres, right?
Yep.
But you have to have a plan and you have to have money. It doesn't grow on trees. You can watch those TV shows. They're made for TV. Most people don't live in those houses that they build because they're unlivable. They build them in 6 weeks. Doesn't work that way. That show called Building Off the Grid is got some of the biggest fakery of what the life is I've ever seen. Literally half the houses you cannot live in.
They're functional.
Unlivable. They're not functional. Well, if you pay attention, like I'll pause it and you can see literally gaps in the ceiling to the outside. And I'm all that. You're not going to make it. There's no insulation. They're in the mountains. They built it with 2x4s. I'm all, you guys are dreaming. You're going to freeze to death. And your roof's going to leak.
Can you imagine watching Gary watch this show?
What's that?
Imagine watching this show, just shaking your head, going, no, this is all wrong. But
Not all, because I mean, usually they find, sometimes they'll find builders who are familiar with it, but for the most part, it's people who are brand new to it, and you have to take that stuff with a grain of salt, because that's with all reality TV. Most of it's not reality.
Right.
It's all scripted. It's a program.
It is. And yours is actually reality. And Gary, we're going to have you for our next segment. So if you hold on, and you're listening to the Lance Robert Podcast with Rich Rosso and Gary Collins at thesimplelifenow.com.
You can get daily real investment news you can use, delivered at the speed of the internet. Sign up for Lance's newsletter now at realinvestmentadvice.com.